weil der Mensch ein Mensch ist, drum braucht er was zum Essen, bitte sehr. Es macht ihn ein Geschwätz nicht satt, das schafft kein Essen her.
Drum links, 2, 3, drum links, 2, 3, wo dein Platz genossen ist, weil ich ein Genialwalter einmeinst und weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Und weil der Mensch ein Mensch ist, drum hat der Stiefel im Gesicht nicht gern. Er will unter sich keinen Sklaven sehen und über sich keinen Herrn.
Drum links, 2, 3, drum links, 2, 3, wo dein Platz genossen ist, weil ich ein Genialwalter einmeinst und weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Und weil der Prolet ein Prolet ist, drum wird ihn kein anderer befreien. Es kann die Befreiung der Arbeiter nur das Werk der Arbeiter sein.
Drum links, 2, 3, drum links, 2, 3, wo dein Platz genossen ist, weil ich ein Genialwalter einmeinst und weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Здравствуйте, comrades. I apologize for the mistimed start of this stream, but those fuckers over at Haymarket Books started their stream early. And I was sitting downstairs on my couch, having my coffee, watching Project Runway innocently, and I got a notification on my phone, and I was like, oh shit, I gotta go live on the internet because we're sure as shit not missing this. So without further ado, guys, we are going to be peeking in on Haymarket Books' live premiere of Transgender Marxism Against the Backlash.
Political philosophy.
And they're just getting started. We haven't missed anything yet. Oh, God. Oh, did I accidentally just
vision forthcoming from Oxford
God.
University Press. And with that, I will get us rolling. So I want to open the conversation with a kind of an open-ended question that I hope each of you will respond to, which is the question raised by our sort of framing, our frame for the conversation, which is why in your view are these attacks on trans people happening, and why is this such a central flashpoint for the far-right attacks on working people right now? So I just want to open us up with that question.
The trans backlash
I'll start with
far-right
Juliana.
attacks on working people. Okay, that doesn't make any sense.
Okay,
Hello.
so this is the pressing question of the moment. So why has the far right come to focus on transgender people, transgenderism, or whatever you want to call it, as its main focus in recent years? I think I don't know really. But one thing to observe historically is that the right wing has entered a sort of dynamic and a rather fascinating and heterogeneous phase over the past few years in ways that I think probably most people can't help but have noticed. When I say it's heterogeneous, I suppose like peaking around 2016, the far right was notably insurgent, but also I would say very bifurcated. It was especially divided around the topic of Judaism and anti-Semitism and kind of conspiratorial theories thereof. And I think what was especially striking about the far right, but usually not observed so clearly, is that the division in the far right at that point in time was between explicit and more sublimated anti-Semitism. So you had figures who were talking about globalists while still vehemently supporting the state of Israel, including much of the leadership of the Israeli state itself. And then you had more kind of like
that is an interesting contradiction. She's
active,
not wrong about that.
kind of worldview anti-Semites who are primarily advancing that position first and foremost.
Why are we talking
And of course,
about
we saw a
anti-Semitism?
group
We're
of
supposed to
them
be talking
marching
about
in their
trans.
chinos on the Capitol of Virginia, and so on. But these moves to kind of attempt to explicate anti-Semitism were rather unsuccessful, I would say. And we saw that the force of the state, following on from anti-fascist efforts, kind of coming down to at least push the people who were involved in that march out of their jobs and so on. So the reason I'm starting off by talking about transphobia by addressing anti-Semitism is that I think there's a sort of like interchangeable move that sort of happens somewhere along the line where clearly explicit like anti-Semitic politics in the United States is something of a non-starter, at least for those who want to sort of attach themselves to an electoral project. So I would say that like the far right has instead sort of latched onto another target, which was always sort of present in a latent way.
You think
So
they
if any of you
replaced
want to
the
like
Jews with the trans?
think about this in sort of some more theoretical detail, there's a very interesting essay by Naomi
Well, that's just shit that's
Eliza
made up
Cohen,
out of
who
nowhere,
has
isn't
written
it?
this essay called the Dread of Talmudic Abstractions, where she sort of goes into the longer history of this overlap
The
between
Jews are
the
totally
trans woman and
interchangeable with the
anti-Semitism
trans.
as a figure. But we
Basically
can
the
see
same
this in all
thing.
kinds of like scholarship and literature on the topic. But I guess this sort of preamble and sort of analogizing move may not be satisfying to people, so maybe we can pass on to someone else. But that's sort of where I would start. I think it's mostly within the far right's sort of need for personification of capital and its sort of inability so far to sort of metastasize that
their
around
personification of the
Jewish
need
people,
for capital.
and
Are
the
you
sort of
shitting me,
interchangeable
Jules?
two-step that it's doing to sort
Do
of move
you
towards,
listen
at this
to the
point,
people you're
trans
commentating
people.
on at
Now, some
all?
would say that it's moving from like anti-Semitism specifically to trans misogyny, but I think it's again a little bit more complicated than that. There's kind of another bifurcation which is arising there. But anyway, that's probably enough to get people started. So I'm about to pass on.
I think it's a great place to start. It's fascinating, and also I think speaks to some of the cynicism of these attacks. So Sandy, would you like to go next? I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, and Jules, as you know, I deeply love that Naomi Eliza Cohen article. I reference it all the time. Yeah,
I reference it all the time.
Yeah, so I love that, and then also I think one thing, you know, in kind of separating out the analogy, actually, and looking at what's different with trans people, I think one
this is a
particular
train wreck.
area
We gotta look
that we
up
have
this
to think
person
about a
after
lot
this.
is well, we have to think of the children.
Yes, we have to think of the children.
In a way that we don't quite
Indeed.
have. I mean, I guess we do have to think of children in the case of the anti-Semitic example, in the blood libel kind of way. But that's
Is this person serious?
Even contemporary anti-Semitism. I mean, the QAnon is definitely doing some blood libel.
Yeah,
but
I want to know what the rest of that
not
shirt says,
quite
Armani.
the
I
central
do.
focus, because a lot of it is more abstracted from that. But
this person is high.
with trans people, we really have to think of the
someone
children.
Go in their chat and ask them if this person is high?
In terms of a few things, right? In terms of how all of those children are getting their genders, right? How all those children are getting their genders and understanding their genders, and learning about the world of genders that exists. And capitalism really needs some specific genders to exist, and gets very stressed out when other ones start cropping up.
What the fuck?
And so that's a part of it. And that's one reason that you see it so, particularly focused in the U.S., particularly on schools, right? There's all the don't say gay type
oh my god,
type
this
legislation.
Is so worth it. This is so worth it just for this alone.
And then also all of that segues into like labor control and labor discipline of teachers, right?
Can someone please go over to their chat and ask if Sandy
controlling
is high?
what teachers are allowed to say.
I can't do it. I can't get talk from their chat.
Using the trans misogynist or the transphobic broadly and homophobic grooming bogeyman, right?
Excellent work,
Against teachers is very effective at like suppressing teachers unions, not least because it's very effective at suppressing gay teachers who are really good at organizing.
Why would suppressing teachers unions be really good at suppressing gay teachers who are really good at organizing? Why would those two things be correlated, Sandy?
Yeah, I mean, I think looking at this question maybe
they
from
started early, guys. This is not my fault. They
less from
the
perspective of like ideological consistency or a progression, and more from the kind of conjunctural moment. I think one of the things that is interesting, if unpleasant to observe over the last several years, really since, in fact, the book Transgender Marxism came out, that period, is really how and when this particular kind and intensity of transphobia has been consolidated in different times and places. And of course, at that time, this was most intense, I think, in the UK, right? And it hadn't quite arrived in the US at the level of coherence and intensity that it has. And it has since then become much more of the central focus of the right-wing backlash here. And I think why the difference between those two, that little time delay, is useful for thinking about what it is about this particular moment of the conjuncture that has consolidated that kind of emergent focus on trans people as the kind of central agenda of the far right. And there's a couple things. One is, I think, what Sandy was alluding to and talking about, following, right, like a big, not just the kind of strike wave in US public schools a few years back, but also the moment of the pandemic, right, where teachers and parents, both in a kind of organized fashion and also, I think, in a kind of much more organic and ad hoc way, but parents and teachers and students really were the people that shut down schools and thereby shut down most businesses during the period in which anything was shut down in the US for the pandemic. And
the schools were shut down by the teachers unions.
This kind of bipartisan effort to reopen schools and thus reopen the economy and reopen the world of profit making necessarily targeted teachers unions, and really specifically targeted that kind of shared interest between parents and teachers and students. And through that targeted, as Sandy was saying, teachers unions and activists. In fact, my essay in Jules' edited volume, it's now quite old, but
this person is also
very much on the topic of why on the topic of why it might be strategic, right, to target trans and queer teachers specifically as a way of targeting both actual and possible solidarity, I think, between parents.
Notice they don't say gay; they only say queer.
So that does get us to, I think, the kind of practicalities, right? And this isn't just the far right. This is also, that was Biden's main agenda upon arriving in office, right? Was to reopen the schools, and that meant putting down the teachers and
but Biden is pro-capitalism and therefore
in a certain way, the far right has done his dirty work for him in that sense.
Oh yes, the far right did Biden's dirty work. Yeah, sure, okay.
Front line of ideological attack, but maybe not the total force of reaction, right? Maybe not even the main force of reaction in that sense. But it gets us to exactly, I think, also both Sandy and Jules mentioned or alluded to this, really also the kind of core question for the far right, which is the family, right? The importance of the family to a kind of fascist worldview as the sort of central zone of
the family as a fascist worldview,
autonomy, patriarchal autonomy and control,
representative of patriarchal autonomy and control.
There's a specific thing, I think, about trans people that locates us as a target when you look at it through that perspective of fascist ideology, right? That is distinct from the kind of anti-Semitic focus in some ways, which is to say trans people
is something else.
Raise questions about the naturalness of the family, raise questions about the goodness of the family as the moral goodness of the family as the site of the production of good and moral citizens in reliable, inconsistent, and predictable ways, right? And by targeting, right, trans people, and especially trans people working in schools, for example, it raises a kind of conflict between the school and the family as who should have the
Wait,
authority.
look at this person in the
the
chat.
state and the family.
I
Who
look
should
at
have the
Planned
authority
Parenthood
over
moving from
the
abortion and women's
moral and
rights towards
educational,
transphobia as a natural progression.
Message that we're sending children or raising children in. And yeah, so that's I think one reason. And really, finally, the pandemic itself, right, really consolidated the conspiracy theory as the kind of model of far right thinking, and it raised that from, I think, a much more fringe kind of but already existent trend into a very dominant one in terms of how people on the right, and not just the far right, think about the world, right? Sort of made explicit that implicit conspiracism that's always present, I think, in right-wing ideology.
Great. I mean, there's a number of questions I think that are raised by that round of comments. And I mean, one of them is just about gender and capitalism. And I want to ask this in a couple different ways. And one is to follow up on Sandy's point about capitalism's reliance and dependence on a particular system of gender and its antipathy towards anything that threatens that. Sandy, you raised that in the course of your comments. I'd love
Almost
to hear
like we're trying to
you say
abolish the
more
gender
about that
binary.
and hear from Juliana and Kate as well. And another question that I have related to that is, you know, to what extent, I mean, when we talk about fascism, oftentimes fascism is grounded in the petite bourgeoisie, right? In these kinds of like this precarious, not in the sense of being about to be homeless, right? Not in the sort of way we usually think about real precarity, but precarious in terms of constantly, they might lose their businesses, right? And sink into the proletariat, you know, Kelleror. And it seems to me that some of the hatred that is directed at children, right? Like it's presented as being directed at, you know, quote unquote groomers or, you know, this or that, right? But the most intimate, like most constant recipients of that hatred are children in the homes of these people. And I know there's some research, like I know there's been research done on Mumsnet, the British message board that helped kind of create a kind of incubator for a lot of anti-trans sentiment, and sort of moderately affluent people are overrepresented, right, as contributors to Mumsnet, and so there's this like connection to the family, both as this site of capitalist reproduction, but also
the family is a site of capitalist
way of
reproduction,
performing a certain kind of middle class respectability that then your trans kid is messing up for you, right? And then this like class hostility that comes out in that way. So I have this kind of combined question, right, about this basically like capitalism and gender, but also not just big capital, but this kind of like anxiety about how do I perform this middle class respectability when my family doesn't perform gender in these socially prescribed ways. And so Sandy, I'll start with you if that's all right, or whoever wants to sort of get in first.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Yeah, there's a lot to chew on there. And a couple of thoughts that I have,
philosophic,
and really sort of speaking to why capitalism needs these genders. But one one part of it is that capitalism specifically needs to control these genders. And I actually want to do a little orthodox Freudianism there a little bit, where what does it mean to to control and prescribe an identity, and particularly a gendered identity, right? Is about controlling. It's also about relationship to sexuality, right, and desire across similarity and difference, right, and through that, I mean, the classic Freudism point, right, about work is some concept.
It's okay,
of,
girl.
You know,
we all like to talk about Freud when we're high as fuck on the internet.
And there's a lot that happens there, but there's another part of sort of prescribing these specific genders, right? But these specific genders, that is about, it's about class, but as you're alluding to with Mumsnet, right? With the English petty bourgeoisie, right? In fact, the step in between class and gender really is race very heavily. And so to that regard, right, how do you reproduce class relations intergenerationally? You reproduce them as race, right? That has this biologically defined signifier class. And then how do you reproduce race intergenerationally? Is in fact very heavily through gender, right? And through the
how do you produce race
the cultural differences and the differences in family organization between Black genders and white genders.
What?
Right?
There are Black and white genders now, guys.
Fact,
breaking news. Black and white.
I think it's really
genders.
no coincidence that the places
no one ask any
in
questions.
the United States
what the fuck does
that
the Black and white gender
heavily
mean?
Doing the anti-trans backlash right now, right, are Florida and Texas, which, as Cade loves to talk about, are both on the Gulf Coast, the most miscegenated part of the United States, right?
It says something like bottoms
the
and
part
tops
of the United
all
States
hate
where
the,
the white people
like
are
that.
most have the most Black ancestry. And it's difficult in those circumstances actually to
Autumn, you
preserve
can
race,
agree that this person is
which
high,
you have to
right?
do, because then how are we going to know
we can
what
at least
class
come
it
to
is?
some like
what class everyone
I mean
is, right?
this is like
so,
obvious. This person is on drugs.
So
I wouldn't be judging,
so
except that they're live on the internet.
Sort of specific genders is very critical to that project, and it's also important with that to understand this, to take this sort of this step beyond.
Excellent. You're queering everything
feminism, as feminism is usually understood, right?
That has queered her identity.
To take this the step beyond that, to say that like white cis het women's genders are also very, very implicated.
What the fuck?
As part of both the system of control of queer people's genders and also of Black people's genders and lives. And I said a lot of
this
things.
This stream is like fucking Christmas. Yes,
Jules,
Philosophics,
do you
we
want
can
to pick
see
up
them.
from me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
I just want to add one quick sort of concrete note is one of the things you notice about the particular bills, the AntiTrans Backlash, and there are like over 500, I think, that have now been introduced, 550 or something, have been introduced in state houses and in the federal sphere in the US. There's a range of different kinds, but there's some of them that are really quite interesting along the lines that Sandy is talking about, some specific ones. And to me, the ones that are the most kind of personally and politically horrifying include, right, the initial bill in Texas that not only kind of criminalized parental acceptance of trans children's transgenders, I think, which, as Jules always points out, remains pretty rare in the scheme of things, but also, in fact, deputized everybody in Texas as kind of reporters, as deputy police social workers, whose job it is to identify this very tiny minority of parents who are supportive of trans people, trans children's genders. That has a certain kind of structure that reminds us, I think, of many different things, but including the structure of Jim Crow and legal slavery in the same part of the U.S., right? Similarly, in Florida, one of the bills that was introduced,
I would like to be
in
an
fact,
ally of black genders, but not
raised
white
the
genders.
idea
How
that you
might I
could
accomplish and
bring
demonstrate this?
charges against a trans accepting parent,
Philosophists, king of the chat,
or
man. I mean,
just a
come on,
trans
that's
person who is a
fucking
parent,
epic.
one might assume, in Florida against people who do not live in Florida. So a kind of Dred Scott structure of anti-trans hatred, and one that, if it was to be enforced anyway, has that kind of potential for conflict between the legal apparatus of different states in a way that kind of very much resurrects that north-south divide in the U.S., or the structural divide in the U.S. I don't know how likely that is to actually come up, but it certainly has. Both of those things, I think, have this ambitious scope and a real chilling effect, I think, on any, especially trans people who are paying attention to them, but on really much more broadly than that as well. I know in my case, it makes me very much loath to go to Texas, where I was born and where much of my family lives, or even said, let my child go to Texas. And I've, despite having not lived in Texas full time for a couple of decades, it's a different thing to feel like actually exiled, not by choice, from your home and from the place where
Literally
you grew up.
nothing is preventing you from going to Texas.
Feeling that way, it for me really highlights the intensity of where this particular conflict has gotten us. It's a new level of intensity, right? All of us have been watching this kind of emerge slowly and then much more quickly as the kind of central focus of the right for the last 7 to 5 years, I would say. But it's a little like, the old saw about frogs boiling in a pot of water or something, that all of a sudden I'm realizing this is a boiling pot of water, not just a very warm one. And I think that is maybe less apparent to even to sympathetic allies, even people who feel in solidarity with trans people. I think that kind of emergent setup of conflicts, not just at this kind of cultural war level, but at this level of legal conflicts, at the level of states' rights, at the level of a much broader and less concentrated kind of vigilante organization than was apparent in the Virginia rally that Jules was mentioning from long back. So that's the main thing I wanted to add there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Juliana, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, I think that point raised by Kate at the end there is really pretty crucial concerning like the personal impact which these
I'm pretty sure the person who just spoke
developments,
spoke at the Socialism conference
kind of
last
have
year on
upon
the
us
transgender Marxism
directly.
panel.
So I suppose this
And
sort of
was
gets us
equally as much
into
of a train wreck.
the rather meta question of what we can gain from analyzing the far right, or if we can really gain so much from it, whether there's
I would
actually
add not
anything
being an ally
to
of cis people.
observe
Fucking
there
Credulin.
analytically, whether they're simply kind of sprouting whatever hateful nonsense sort of gives them opportunistic traction, or whether there's anything deeper going on there. So obviously in my opening remarks, I was sort of drawing this historical progression from the focus around like an attempt to sort of rehabilitate political worldview anti-Semitism through this kind of nativism. So this Charlottesville protest, specifically what they were chanting was Jews will not replace us, kind of introducing this idea that the great replacement is happening, and that the white majority of America is going to become a minority, and that's going to be a terrible thing because everyone knows how we treat minorities. So so with that point of view, I suppose what you'd predict in that view, if you believe that the far right is opportunistic and simply has this kind of craven, compulsive hatred which sort of latches on from one target to the next, you would think, well, the primary aim in our struggles and our political orientation should sort of be direct resistance and putting out fires and defeating these bills and electing Democrats and so on, which is I suppose an intuitive and a view which many people would sort of attach to. But I think the reason it is useful to scrutinize the right, and the reason it is useful to kind of try and have an analysis of where their targets appear, is not only because we can then have a predictive stance and sort of a better development of consciousness about what capitalism looks like today and where it's going to head to, but also I think because we can then sort of move beyond an analysis which frames them as the center of our politics. So specifically, when we use these terms like backlash, which is the title of this talk, or we use words like reactionary, I think that the risk for left-wing activists and the risk for socialists and communists or fellow travelers or whoever else is we sort of like we introduce an agency to the far right, which it does have, which it certainly does exhibit, but we sort of trail off on the follow through. So we say someone's a reactionary, we say there's a backlash. It's like, well, what is this backlash to? What are they reacting against? What is the reaction happening in response to? And this is sort of the question which, once you ask it and once you examine it, you start to realize that basically the issue is with the far right is it intuitively senses. It has an intuitive sense about what destabilizations or what ruptures capitalism is churning out, but it then cannot develop like a deeper, further going understanding. So when Tucker Carlson goes on his show and he has a monologue about how he doesn't want his teenage son to be stoned and pretending to be a woman, Tucker Carlson has an obvious vision which he can share with millions of people and find a response to. But the issue is that Tucker Carlson doesn't then doesn't fully know about ordering DIY hormones or
no one should know about ordering
marijuana and hormones, anti-Mexican racism or anything like that, and he certainly doesn't want to. So our issues is like we basically have to listen to what the far right are saying and then attempt to understand why are they concerned about the things that they are. I'll continue for a minute, that's fine. So for instance, why are they so furious about librarians? We've talked about teachers. Why are librarians because this sudden hate figure of all of the people you could possibly pick in society? Suddenly there are TikTok accounts which are like because posting up librarians asking children if they're they them and trying to get them murdered. Librarians are organizing drag queen story hours and the Proud Boys are showing up outside and trying to storm into these protests and terrifying the parents and their children. So specifically, like, why are the far right obsessed with librarians? I don't actually think it's an irrational focus.
Because you guys took over the American Library Association.
Increasingly, childcare is not something which is being done by parents. It's being done by private carers who are hired and paid by the hour. It's being done by teachers who are bringing chunks of their wages into school to feed to these children. And it's being done by these highly trained, primarily female and increasingly non-binary professionals.
It's stuff they order off the internet.
Are highly educated, fully in tune with the latest social theorization, developmental theory, pedagogy, and so on, and unrecognized by most kind of people when they consider what the political or social landscape looks like. But the right wing intuitively identifies the importance which they have to raising the next generation and correctly perceives them as a threat to the sort of harmonious household authority structure, which has clearly been disintegrating for some time. So this is just one case in point where we can kind of start to understand when we actually look at what fascists are doing, when they consider their rhetoric and so on, we can like identify not only why they're operating, but also the things which we're able to understand and the shared understandings which
I
we're already
have her
coming
on
to
video talking about
with
doing
certain
testosterone as a
proletarian,
party
in this
drug,
case, sort of mostly
as like a
state-employed
rave
workers,
thing that
and why it is
take
that so many of
testosterone
these
and then they go to
towns
like a rave or like a
and
club or whatever.
kind of provincial
Mhm.
provincial villages and so on are preferring to actually close down these centers of social reproduction. So you see you see story after story about these isolated towns which are closing down one of their few childcare offering facilities rather than allowing this kind of woke ideology to continue. And the reason that they're trying to do this is because they are very important. And so anyway, I think that's why we have to begin. And there's a lot more I could say about what is actually happening and what is actually making transgender life and what is making transsexualism proliferate in the way that it is, because it's not simply a right-wing fantasy, and it's also not something which they can understand. So that's kind of my starting point. Maybe the other two can riff off that, or maybe you've got something to say, Vanessa.
Well, I mean, I just I feel like I'm like I have this like furrowed brow through so much of the conversation, and it is a furrowed brow of like great appreciation because I think that's such a brilliant point, and I want to follow up on that. I want to actually connect it to a point I think that Cade made earlier about conspiracism and the COVID-19 pandemic and the sort of flowering of conspiracism as this dominant mode of theorizing, if we can call it that, theorizing reality. And there's, I mean, part of the anxiety, antipathy, hatred towards trans people is a hatred of science. And I think the point, Jules, that you just made about these towns and these movements that are happy to attack educators and attack
people to order it off the internet, and they're like, you just hate science.
Institutions of education for children, and also I thought that your point about how highly trained and highly these are educators who have degrees and are have studied pedagogy and have thought a lot about how to organize information and convey it right to people. Like that's what a librarian is, right? And the fact that is, that kind of practice is seen as antithetical to the practice of maintaining this kind of control that is that occurs through gender, in addition to many other categories, as Sandy mentioned, with race and class. But I just want to kind of invite each of you to develop that line more, because it came up in each of your comments. Just like this anti-science, anti-knowledge, anti-reality kind of core, right, to some of this anti-trans legislation and violence and rhetoric, right? This hatred of the idea that people might learn more about their bodies, and that in the process of learning about their bodies, they might actually exercise some kind of agency over their bodies and decide that they want their bodies to be organized in a way that better matches, right, what's needed for their flourishing as an individual. And the connection to that, and the idea that maybe a lot of people will get that idea, and maybe they'll get the idea that they can use science to change a lot of things that are not in correlation with what actually promotes human flourishing. So I just wanted to especially, I'll just add another thing, especially I think it's interesting that so much of the anti-trans rhetoric claims to be attacking trans people for not recognizing reality, right? While at the same time, of course, the rhetoric itself is completely unscientific. And Jules, I just, what I love about your point is how
I don't like the rhetoric.
pointed out that
How
this
is it
is not just a kind of debate about science that's happening at some abstract level, right? We can see that materially one side needs to destroy the systems of education and science in order to get its way, right? So I just want to that's a big old mess. But basically, what I'm asking is, what about the Okay, good. Yeah. What about hostility to science and hostility to reason, and its centrality to some of these anti-trans bits of rhetoric and legislation and violence? And anybody can start. Jules, if you'd like to follow up, but as I mentioned, Cade mentioned the point about
I'm not opposed to
conspiracism.
comprehensive sex ed at all. I think there should be comprehensive sex ed
about this, which is
not crazy queer
it takes us
Marxist
back,
bullshit.
in fact, to you raising Mumsnet in terms of where a certain kind of scientific, right, but scientific conspiracism really incubated, and that is exactly in online,
definitely
not just mothers forums, but pregnancy forums, right, where people really dug in on a kind of DIY naturalistic natural birth concept, right, as a moral good. And it dovetailed very well with, for example, and especially in the UK, the attacks and destruction on the NHS, right? It's not just about information conveyance in terms of science. It's also about the delivery of healthcare in terms of science, right? So this came up here during the pandemic when you saw fascist vigilantes literally fighting nurses like in the street over treating COVID patients.
When
right?
did that happen?
When you say attacks on science, like that's very material.
Was there some sort of like fucking West Side Story showdown?
The fact that this kind of incubator of like an ideology of natural motherhood and also DIY, not state-supported motherhood, rooted in exactly this, self quote unquote research about the sort of natural completeness of the body's ability to reproduce and so forth. It's very interesting in retrospect to see actually how important that particular launching pad was for the development of what's now become this robust constellation of conspiracies theories about, everything from 5G Wi-Fi to biowarfare and so forth, but which
that's not
seems,
a conspiracy theory
at first
anymore,
glance very incoherent,
actually,
but in fact,
as it were,
are overlapping, mutually, often mutually supportive conspiracy theories that simply just have, in each case, a little different emphasis on exactly which thing is being most discussed, but have increasingly become more coherent, more total, and much more recognizable, I think, as a kind of coherent fascist politics than they were 5 to 7 years ago, and when they existed much more in little pieces around the internet.
Sandy or Jules?
I'm happy for Sandy to go first.
Yeah, Sandy.
Yeah.
Oh, here we go. They pre-recorded this and still aired it.
I really like the one thing that Cade worded in there was describing these sort of anti-scientific
I'm gonna work on that, Beth. Thank you.
Movements as scientific, but not scientific.
Scientistic. What the fuck does that mean?
And I think, well, I say this one because I also think it's true that a lot of mainstream science, as it's understood, right, as certainly within like the academy, right, is scientistic but not scientific.
What does that mean?
My last comment, I outed myself as a relatively orthodox Freudian, and within the sciences, that's not taken especially seriously a great deal of the time. And
what does scientistic mean? Is this a socialist word?
In exactly the relationship of science and scientism being scientistic, seeming scientific versus actually being scientific. I think it's also, I mean, we're talking a lot about teachers, librarians. We also have to talk about like actual doctors, right? And sort of the
oh god, I'm
Sandy
downloading this
Stone
stream
point,
right after this.
right?
finish this.
The Sandy Stone point's
Oh,
about like
shit.
Sandy Stone point's about trans people getting access to hormones and surgeries
Thank you, Jenny.
by figuring out what they need to tell the doctors to convince those doctors that I'm the right candidate, right? I fit your scientific criteria. And I think
I'm gonna make a clip video after this called
one
Marxist
thing
on
that you
drugs.
see with far right anti-scientific conspiracism is they're in certain ways like right to look at these institutions of knowledge and authority and say,
really?
hey, that's not scientific, you're full of it, right? Right there, I agree with people who mistrust doctors, right?
Scientistic is a word often used to refer to a way of relating to
I
science
agree with
because
people who
lip service
mistrust
is an idea of
doctors
being
and
scientific without really being scientific at all.
And certainly people, I have plenty of
They're
mistrust
trying to
of a
pretend
certain
that scientific
kind
is
of
not a made up fucking word
education.
because someone's high.
Although I love learning.
They love
and
learning though, guys.
within that, like, it's easy to see how without like, or I can see the shape of how without an alternative
Thank you,
to that,
James
right?
Jones.
Without an alternative science that is actually scientific, and without I guess what I'm saying is it's like
I'll just
the
say,
things
Sandy,
that
I
we're doing.
hate to, I don't want to cut
Yeah.
you off. I just want
She's
to
like,
mention
we're
that
rating this shit back in, bro.
I want to make sure that Juliana gets in, and I have one last question I want to ask everyone.
Yes, amazing.
So yeah, but please, by all means, finish
Yeah,
The person who gave the comment in the chat about
I'm off a little, but
this woman right here, this black woman, Vanessa.
I'm saying that the
Vanessa
thing
is
that
trying to
we're
justify
doing
this
is
bullshit.
we are doing science better than the scientific authorities. And
we're doing
I'm
science
not
better
quite,
than the
here,
scientists.
Jules, help me out. Take my point home.
Yeah, why not? Okay, so I'm sure that Spectre magazine viewers are very curious about some more explicit connections that
I'm sure
this has to Marx, who of course
Spectre
saw himself as
magazine
doing
is thrilled with this outcome
a
for their
scientific
promotion.
socialism or an attempt at it. And what did that mean to Marx, and what can we do with that today? I guess that's where I'm going to take this question. And I appreciated Sandy's remarks, and especially Vanessa's kind of like teasing at this idea of like self-transformation or lability, as the 20th century sexologists would call it, the lability, the flexibility of sex and resexuation, and what we can do with that scientifically, and whether we can do anything with that. And I think we can do a lot, and I think we should. And really this question of like a scientific understanding of something which was previously taken to be more fixed or inevitable or more immutable is really sort of Marxism's origin story, its birth. So Marx's understanding of classical economics, which he had a very critical view of, but also drew all of the kind of key categories and arguments
exactly,
of his work in response to,
on Marxism.
was quite a profound one. And specifically with classical economics, much of what Marx saw was a kind of determinate negation, a replacement which retained something with an earlier more agronomics, or more kind of farming focused school of economics called physiocracy. And specifically, Marx drew his concept which today we talk about a lot in terms of social reproduction. When Marx is talking about reproduction, he usually means like kind of several things at a time. He uses the term in different ways, and specifically what he calls simple reproduction. So when something replicates itself directly without expansion. This was a concept which he drew from a work called The Economic Table by Francois Cuisnet, who was this French physiocrat thinker. And the physiocrats, at their most simple, believed that society was primarily about productive labor, which was a source of every national wealth, or every national income actually came from productive labor. When I say that they were like more agronomics or more farming focused, they believed that industrial labor was kind of not superfluous, but sort of an extra add-on to society. And of course, with classical economics, this again gets flipped around. So the industrial becomes central to economic considerations, which of course is something which is distinctive about Marxists as well. We kind of believe that this industrial kind of factory set of relations is indispensable for analysis, even if it's not the only thing going on in any given society. So basically what Marx develops when he kind of takes this classical economic view is a sort of understanding of these two things operating at the same time. So why is this important for like scientific understandings of politics? Well, the reason it's important is because Marx is the people Marx was surrounded by working in London, and his sort of rivals, if you will, were these liberal thinkers who believed that you could reduce social questions down to like numerated charts specifically around calories. So Marx's rivals were these social reformers who are sort of, in many cases, industrialists, in many cases, sort of colonial officers like John Stuart Mill, who sort of had this vision of social transformation where topics like starvation or poverty and so on could now be sort of understood scientifically and numerically, even through understanding like, oh, well, there are these people called the urban poor, and how much do the urban poor need to eat every week? How many calories do they need to consume in order to survive? So this was like a set of like scientific understandings of social problems, which Marx simultaneously understood as very pressing and vital, and something which he needed to have a response to, but also something which he realized was never going to appear like sufficiently, which these like liberal reformers alongside him were never really going to have complete and full and satisfying answers to. Partially because of their sort of like their lineage, their trapping in these kind of struggles of economic theory, which I was kind of briefly sketching out for you, and partly because they were colonial officers, because they were members of the bourgeoisie, they were factory owners, much like his friend Engels, who were never quite going to reach a full dialectical realization of the struggle which lay ahead. Much like his friend Engels, but that's just me being bitchy. So basically, the issue with the issue we're running into here is that much like Marx, there are these kind of like fundamentally incomplete or flawed understandings, which are offered by people like clinicians, Democratic Party functionaries, people who happily head NGO charity organizations, trying to sort of replace civil society functions for collapsing welfare states, and the people who are overseeing those collapsing welfare states. There are people who are sort of understanding the dimensions of the problem, and people who are sort of roughly appear to be on our side, appear to be against fascism and in favor of transgenderism and trans rights in a kind of liberal formation and a civic emancipatory formation, but who will never actually have the more profound, more deep, more revolutionary understanding which we're trying to achieve. So yeah, I think that's kind of like that's sort of what we specifically that's what we need to kind of like consider ourselves as part of, but also at a distance from. So when we talk about like our immersion or like defenses of science, we always have to kind of come at it with that approach I was just outlining, where we sort of look at the lineages of the kind of like so-called objective fields which we're interacting with, and we realize just like things are never actually going to break down into these nice spreadsheet charts and these nice like emancipatory quantitative tables that are going to lead us to liberation. So that's our stance from the scientific, I think.
Yeah, just quickly to add, I think maybe a little bit of historical science to this, is that
sorry, I was just saying I do have one last question. I want to make sure we have time for everyone to answer. So, but yes, please go.
I'll be very brief, which is just to say that precisely in practice, the kind of history of queer radicalism in the 20th century, and I think also in this one, puts on the table really exactly the I think we have to say dialectical view of science that Jules was just raising, that science can simultaneously be this process of knowledge making and world changing, right? But also that it is necessarily also a social process of doing that. And for example, if you look at ACT UP and the both the combination, right, of self community generated research, demands for research, DIY healthcare, becoming itself a source, right, of new scientific possibility in the institutional bedrock of science as a social institution. That's where you see that process that I think Jules is just describing abstractly having already occurred, and of course continuing to occur very much in trans people's attempts and successful attempts to create and access trans healthcare.
So my nemesis, the great historian of hermaphroditism, Alice Drager, has this formation in her god-awful book, Galileo's Middle Finger, where she talks about this dichotomy between activism and science. And my key argument is always that this dichotomy has never existed. This dichotomy has never been present, ever. There has never been a clear distinction between queer, LGBT, intersex, trans activism and the sciences. You see this, as Kate has alluded to, in ACT UP, where all of the men involved in it were male registered nurses in the first round of it, prior to what becomes ACT UP. The people producing these groups were either drag queens, registered nurses, or both. You see this in trans DIY communities today, where people are predominantly trained in the biological or chemical sciences. DIY. Very rarely you find autodidactic people. But mostly, again, you're looking at nurses, biological researchers, in some cases self-taught nerds deep diving into PubMed, but definitely not people who are ignoring science, no matter what their training background may be. You see it in intersex activism, where the original group, the ISNA, the Intersex Society of North America, was launched in an editorial response to a magazine entitled The Sciences, in response to Anne Fausto Sterling and her very provocative piece about there being 5 sexes. Like, anywhere you look, you only find activists who are nerdily burrowed into the existing institutions and who don't belong into them and are usually excluded from them in tacit or more explicit ways, but who are fully immersed and kind of have this have exactly this progression, which, like Hegel shows us in the philosophy of right, where they have been alienated through their education and are then driving this against their oppressive conditions. So anyway, I'll let you have your final question.
I hate to. Well, I wish we had like 3 more hours.
I wish you guys had 3 more hours too, Vanessa.
I wanted to end the conversation with. I mean, it seems to me like one of the things that has to be denied by so much of the anti-trans rhetoric is the fact that, and I know this through osmosis, observe, just like knowing my friends, knowing each of you, like being trans is pretty cool. There's joy, right? And like self-realization.
There wasn't that. I'm sorry. They caught me off guard because they went live 45 minutes early. This question really comes from
observing Cade's
I apologize.
social media presence, actually, because Cade takes these beautiful photographs of his friends, right? And of trans nightlife and
apparently I need to look up Cade.
Rock shows with trans bands that Sandy's in, right? And all this stuff. And I wanted Cade to talk a little bit about that act of
a double super chat
of presentation, of preservation, of documenting, of and as a participant and the importance of showing, right? If I could ask in such a abstract manner, the importance of showing, really. And so I direct that to Cade, and then I also am
I gotta follow
very
interested
to hear what Juliana and Sandy think about just the importance, right, of this.
Yeah. So I mean, one thing I would say is that I've gotten much back into taking photographs. I was very interested in that as a very young adult and stopped taking any kind of pictures or photographs on September 11th, 2001, for reasons relating to that, but also just kind of got into a space where I was doing much more academic work and so forth, and not doing either
I am
that kind of
absolutely
artistic
not
work
going
or
to that conference,
playing music. I
Trendlin.
think
I
I did
don't
a
know
long
why
time
you
before
would have
that. And
such
I've
an
gotten back
idea
into
that I would
both
be
in the
going to
course of the
that
pandemic
conference.
and
I
also
am
in the course of
definitely not going.
beginning of medical transition.
Definitely,
And I don't think those are
not.
kind of
It's a really
unrelated
bad idea.
facts, but neither is the fun I have taking pictures of queer people for nightlife, unrelated to my training as an anthropologist and ethnographer. In fact, this is one of the main tools of ethnography. But I guess what I would say is my main audience for doing that is not cis people. It's actually the trans people in my community, and it's in part because it's also on social media. It's very much a collaborative, iterative kind of a thing to do, right? My goal often in taking a photograph is for the person I'm photographing to see themselves, right? And to see themselves in a context, to see what they look like to me, what they look like maybe to everybody around in this particular moment, right? That's also that I'm trying to capture. And I think that process, right? That's kind of a description of a very specific milieu and experience that people have when transitioning as adults and being part of a trans community. But I think it's also just a kind of description generally of human social life, right? That we become ourselves through other people. There's an embarrassing Zulu word I'm not going to repeat for that because it's much overused, but it is also true, right? That and very much a Marxist point that we are most ourselves, right, through the process of being ourselves with and through other people. We develop ideas about what kind of selves you can be exactly that way. And that, I think, is part of the explanation, right, for something Jules raised earlier of why are there so many new trans people now? I mean, I think Jules and I have been talking about that for many years, and we can talk about the family and all that, but it's also partly it becomes a self-reproducing, growing
like a social
community
contagion.
of mutual
Like a social
recognition,
contagion,
development,
it
and expansion of
self-reproduces
possibility. And
like a social contagion.
Is that
what
your
you're
whole
saying, Kate?
self, right?
That the trans ideology, the
becomes more
queer ideology
possible.
is a social
And by that, I don't
contagion?
just mean, changing your gender or whatever. I also mean
Thank you,
like
Jenny.
being yourself who's a writer, but maybe also a photographer and also a musician and also, a fisher by morning and right. And I think, if we take Marx's vision seriously, it really is those parts of life that are like most worth living that should be the object of that vision, but are not just some distant horizon. They're actually necessarily part of the process of arriving at whatever that future society might look like. That's my answer to that question.
Thank you. Yeah. And I would love if we could have some final remarks from Juliana and Sandy. And I guess the question in a more open-ended way is about the importance of seeing and being seen, of mutual recognition, right, as Cade put it. Yeah. Jules.
Yeah, I think those glimpses, those glimpses that the social media presence get are sort of part of the answer to this question of how there are so many more trans people, how there has been this proliferating moment. But I want to pass over to Sandy. I got one more thing to say, but I'll pass over to Sandy mostly because I know she's been performing and been organizing a lot of these hardcore shows. So maybe that's
yeah. So one thing I'll say, once upon a time, the nightlife, the underground, was much more underground than it is now. And it is still pretty underground, but it used to be further under. And also, there were a lot fewer trans people, and there was a much narrower range of jobs that those trans people were doing, mainly sex work, right? Very, very heavily sex work. And within that, you need photographers in that ecosystem to take pictures of you for your hooker ads, right? And then instead of why are there
Sandy
so
is the
many
gift that
more
keeps
trans
on
people,
giving.
working the other way around, there are so many more trans people, then what? All of a sudden, it becomes like kind of almost possible to imagine like making a living out of trans cultural production within a trans scene for a trans audience.
Like you're grifting?
And then you need an Instagram.
Like
Right?
you're
And then
grifting? Like
yeah,
you're
then you
just
need an
doing it
Instagram.
to
You
get
need
famous on the
pictures
internet?
of you there. And
And to get
so
social media attention, Sandy? Tell us more. Tell us more,
it's
girl.
also part of it's also a very important part of like a labor ecosystem of trans cultural production. And so within that, then, it kind of points to like, well, to do that, right? To do that well, right? To take those pictures well, you need to be doing the recognition, right? And it is so, yeah, you need to be doing the recognition. And so there's no way out of doing the recognition. And that's kind of the joy of it, right? That's the gravedigger, right? Is that like the labor conditions of like, I'm trying to play these gigs. Hopefully I might pay my rent with them in some capacity, right? Because I have all this dead labor and making me a really good musician. I need trans community recognition, and trans community needs to recognize me because they need music, right? They need all this different kind of artistic production. And I think there's so much rich horizon in there, and
The
some
trans
and
community needs you to be a
organizational
musician?
possibility.
Okay,
I love that, and
sure.
I love ending on a note of the creativity and the new
Associate professor
possibilities
at George
for
Washington
human
University, by the way.
expression that
Vanessa is
that
a
are
Cutting to
opened up
college
stuff.
by
fucking
actually having a
professor at
community.
George Washington University.
I'm sorry.
That's fun. No, I agree with you, Vanessa. Can I
Yay.
just close? I'm terrible at saying goodbye. Can I just close with maybe turning the tables for a second? So you've produced this remarkable book on Marx and morality, which I've read with great passion.
Yes.
You've also published essays on topics like Marx's irreligiousness, so his kind of like his sort of
We've now lost Kate.
his refusal of
Kate has
theism, which
disappeared.
is not even
They
atheistic, but is sort of God
pre-recorded this shit.
disregarding morality, kind of indifferent. Let's
She's
say.
a professor at George Washington
So
University.
often the far right is sort of focused around, if not Christianity, then at least some kind of moral appeal or some notion of society's
We're not
degeneration,
Christians
its decay,
here,
its
honey.
collapse.
Well, I'm not a Christian anyway. Some people are Christians, I
as
guess.
people who want to radically transform, overturn, and abolish all sorts of different parts of society, what should we do as Marxists, kind of in reply to that? What do you think is the best
Kate
move
is back. Don't worry.
for responding to moralists? What's our side of this argument?
The moral argument in that case being something like not adhering to binary cisgender is inherently degenerate, or is that
the capitalism is generating moral collapse and alienation in the Heideggerian sense rather than the Marxist sense, that this technology is an onslaught that is making us fall to pieces and so on. So how do we reply to this kind of half-hearted critique of capital?
I guess
contribution as Marxists. What can we do?
I mean, and just briefly, because we're gonna wrap up in a moment, but just briefly, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is to say, like, there is a degeneration of of these like social categories. There is a destructive element that capitalism plays in ripping up the material basis of these static eternal forms of, or what we're taken to be anyway, these static eternal forms of social life that all human social existence must find itself contained within. that they're not wrong. Like, I mean, much of making a similar kind of move to the one that you beautifully made with respect to the targeting of educators, right? And the this, it's true. But it's a kind of a kind of stodgy, stultifying, suffocating system of attempting to compress all the different ways that people exist as gendered and sexed and as having sexuality and all of these things, trying to compress them into this form that is, first of all, it's self-historical, historically emergent. Like, we can point to specific times that these categories of cis heterosexual manhood and cis heterosexual womanhood emerged, and in much of the world they emerge really late with colonialism, right, and with attempts to stamp out other ways of organizing human life. And so we can point that out and point out that just as this is a kind of set of categories that that emerges at a particular moment in time, it's one that can pass away in the course of history, and that should be helped along in that. Now, what is it that trans people and trans rights and allies of trans people are accused of destroying? Well, they're accused of destroying traditional gender. Well, that's true, right? But also, why is that supposed to matter? Because somehow it's going to lead to the well, the big thing is the groomer thing, right? Somehow this has to do with the children, and it's all about protecting the purity and sanctity of children. But oftentimes the people making these arguments are the same ones who sexualize children in really creepy and bizarre ways. And
How?
And so on that level, it's just disingenuous. It's just obvious that they're lying and don't care. And so all of that, I feel like, was very, all of that is, I wasn't expecting to answer any questions.
So, I love being non-hierarchical.
Exactly, non-hierarchical. So I feel like all of that is very sort of top of the dome here, but that's the kind of move that I would be inclined to develop.
Professor at George Washington University.
Thank you. So with that, I want to thank our speakers again for being with us for this hour. And I want to tell our viewers that if you wish that you could continue this conversation with us, as I do, you can. So you can become monthly donors to Spectre. And as a monthly donor to Spectre Journal, you will receive an invitation for a discussion with us on Zoom.
Oh, really?
And you'll have an opportunity to talk back and to raise all sorts of additional questions for us so that we can continue this conversation. I learned so much and benefited so much from being part of this, and I really thank each of you for being with us today. So
thanks for that.
Thanks again. Yeah, thank you. And that's
Thank
it.
You so much.
Bye. Yeah. See you soon, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
What the fuck did we just watch? What the fuck was that? Bro. Okay, so what happened for people who are just showing up and they're like, it's over already? Those assholes started early. And so on their Eventbrite page, they had it starting at 1 p.m., but on their YouTube channel, they had it starting at 2 p.m. I don't know if it was like a deliberate, like, diversionary tactic or they just screwed up. My inclination is probably the latter. But what happened is that they started early. And I was sitting on my couch downstairs when I got the notification that they were live, and I ran my ass up here to make sure we brought you that entire stream just for you guys. And now I'm going to download the recording of this stream before they try to take it down, because what the hell was that? I have watched some crazy socialist shit in my day. I have never I need to go back and watch again, because at least 2 of them were high. They said they talked about DIY trans on several occasions in that stream, which basically is like when you get your hormones off of, like, well, probably ill-considered sources on the internet, and you trans yourself rather than, like, you know, going to the trans doctor. That is a real thing, by the way. They do encourage people to do that, like, in the trans discords. And so I also, for people who don't know this, we've actually watched Jules quite a bit. Jules was the one with the lipstick. I have Jules on video from, not from this, but from a separate presentation, talking about how they use testosterone as like a party drug. And it's and she's also the one talking about this DIY trans thing, which is really weird. But they use it to get high before they go out and stuff like that. So it's like a weird thing. The black woman that was moderating it, Vanessa, I said this several times, but just in case like the audio wasn't, like, Vanessa is a professor or an associate professor, whatever, at George Washington University. That is a really good school. That is like a really tough school to get into. And here she is moderating a panel of lunatics, at least 2 of which were definitely, probably, I'm pretty fucking sure, on drugs. I'm gonna make a whole montage of Sandy just talking and call it Marxist on drugs, because that was just some of the best I'm gonna now look for every video that Sandy has ever been in, ever, because that was something else right there. But anyway, we were a little rushed today. I apologize for that. It's not my fault that socialists consider a clock and time to be an aspect of white supremacy. Also, I need to watch this again to really kind of, I think I was just like in a state of shock. But like when they were talking about how like the alt-right is going, like, what did they say? There are black and white genders now? Like, what the fuck was that? They did their best to like basically equate anti-Semitism and race and trans, and if you're against any of these things, you're a right-wing fascist. Guys, we really witnessed something today, and I just wanted to thank you all for being here, because I really thought I had seen it all. I really didn't think this was going to be any big deal. We have watched a metric ton of transgender Marxism and queer Marxism on this channel, more than most. And I really didn't think we were going to learn anything new today. And oh my God. And you know what? Here's the most amazing part to me. They pre-recorded that for a sponsorship of like their Spectre journal or whatever. And don't think I'm not thinking about signing up for that to get into their private Zooms, which of course I would never do. I would never, ever, ever do that. But you know, maybe I would. I'm just saying. They fucking pre-recorded that and thought that that was just great to air for this sponsored webinar, live stream, panel discussion, whatever. But it is amazing to me that they literally pre-recorded that for a sponsorship slot. And they thought that that was just great. And these people are winning, and this is what kills me. The right is so inept, and I don't even consider myself to be on the right, but like the right is so goddamn inept that the people that we saw today, with at least 50% of that panel on drugs, They're winning. How is this possible? This is like not acceptable, conservatives. You've really got to, yo, come on, man. Come on. I mean, I'm all for watching the world burn, but this is just really bad, guys. This is like a team of like adult baseball players who continually lose to 5-year-olds playing t-ball and then repeatedly. Here's what this is. This is like a team of like an adult professional or like minor league baseball players, but they're all grown ass adults. They've all been playing baseball like a really long time. They've all got the nice pressed uniforms. They've got the nicest stadium. They've got the nicest fucking practice field. And it's like watching that team of adults lose to a team of like drunken 5-year-olds playing t-ball. And the adult baseball team, even though they are getting their literal asses kicked by the 5-year-olds playing fucking t-ball, the team of adults still manages to convince themselves with Matt Walsh as their head fucking coach that they're somehow winning. This is pathetic, conservative. This is pathetic. I'm sorry. If the right cannot see the problem with this situation, that people who are producing content like that are literally, they are so inept. Does anyone like have any questions about why I say the right deserves to lose? Honestly. Because if you can't get it together to beat what we just watched, you don't deserve to win if you can't get it together to beat what we just watched. I'm sorry. Like, take your fucking toys and go home. I don't care anymore. Because, like, this is pathetic. It's the U.S. women's professional soccer team being beat by a high school JV team. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. God. All right, guys. Well, I think that is all we have for right now. I apologize for going early, but again, it wasn't my fault. I've got their stream downloaded just in case they take that monstrosity off their channel. I've already got it downloaded, so we'll do something with that. But guys, I'm going to be off for the rest of the day because I just usually take Sundays off. But if you are a supporting member of my Substack, which I haven't been posting on a lot this week, and I do apologize about that. It's been a weird week. I've been sick and under the weather and all this stuff. But like, if you do become a supporting member of my Substack, which you can find at Carlyn, KARLYN.substack.com, I will have a newsletter going out later with supporter perks to include our 2 Zoom calls that we do every week on Mondays and Wednesdays. We also have movie night tonight. We're watching MASH at 8 p.m. in my supporter Discord. I'll be sending the link out for that over on the Substack for paying supporters at $5 a month, $50 a year. And you can also get that by becoming a member of my locals community, becoming a member of my Patreon, even becoming a member of this here YouTube channel. We are watching the original MASH tonight. I've never seen it, but apparently Jennifer claims it's good. But that's what we will be watching tonight in the Discord at 8 p.m. And we do movie nights every single Sunday at 8 p.m. And I need to go like drink or something. Yes, we are having a MASH watch party at 8 p.m. tonight in the supporter Discord. I will be sending out the link to the Discord to everyone who is a paying member in the places. But for right now, I'm going to go cry and mourn where we are in this as a state of our country where these jackasses are beating us. I just cannot even. All right, guys, I will see you tomorrow at 5 p.m. or I will see you tonight in the Discord if you are a member. And let's all just try to enjoy the rest of our Sunday. All right, take care, guys. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you soon. Bye.